Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Adaptation Planning and Practices. My name is Leslie Brandt. I'm one of the co-instructors, and with me today is Anna Marie Rutledge, and she'll be kicking off the first part of this lecture.
All right, well, we can get started, I think. So first off, welcome back. We hope you all feel refreshed after having a week off. Like Leslie said, my name is Anna Marie Rutledge, and I'm a climate outreach specialist with NIAX. Leslie and I will be your instructors for this session as well as next week's. And this is the 5th session in the Adaptation Planning and Practices course. Today we will discuss Step 5, monitoring and evaluating effectiveness of adaptation actions. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with Zoom etiquette at this point, but just a reminder to please mute yourself. And if you're using a phone, please turn off your computer speakers to avoid any feedback. So as you know, Maria and Danielle are your course leads, but for today and next week, Leslie and I will be taking over. And if you're interested in learning more about our team, please visit forestadaptation.org/team. Our agenda today includes an introduction to Step 5, monitoring, and then I'll hand it off to Leslie, who will walk us through a tutorial on using the workbook. And finally, Leslie will give us a summary of work to be completed before our class next week. So first, we'll review where we are. In our first week, you defined your goals and objectives. Then you assessed your vulnerabilities in the second week. In the third step, you evaluated your goals and objectives given climate change considerations. Then in the fourth step, and I think this is everyone's favorite part, you started to develop adaptation tactics that address your challenges and capitalize on your opportunities. This week, you will brainstorm ways to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of your selected tactics. And as you start to complete the adaptation workbook, you can also practice exporting your workbook to a PDF or Word document. And this will help you visualize how each step is helping to communicate your intentional adaptation. And Leslie will show you how to do that in the tutorial component of this class. You can also start to think about becoming an online demonstration project. So once you have exported your workbook, one of your instructors can easily turn that into a demo that can be posted on the Forest Adaptation website and update it when you begin implementation or other activities in your project. So monitoring is essentially about asking the right question that will help you detect desired conditions over time. There are several different types of monitoring that you'll encounter in science and management. So for example, in scientific research as a monitoring tool, we may have a question and a hypothesis, and with quality replication, we can judge deviation through time. But most of us find this difficult and require many years before we can detect statistical change. So we don't often use this type of monitoring in adaptation planning. Another type of monitoring is impact or response monitoring. This describes change over time, but this type of monitoring doesn't rigorously support cause and effect. It consists of repeated measurements done to specific standards. So for example, we use forest inventory and stocking surveys to measure growth, canopy cover, ground cover, or survival of planted seedlings. Phenology monitoring is another example where you might record the dates of leaf out or bird arrival every spring. This type of monitoring usually attempts to answer a particular question that is relevant to your management goals, but this type of monitoring can be expensive and time-consuming as well. So wherever this is possible, it's good to piggyback on those existing inventories or surveys. And then we have implementation monitoring, which can be useful if we're implementing an action because of climate change, and we want to monitor the execution of that change. And this is often a yes or no type of observation. Another type of monitoring is effectiveness monitoring. If you define the desired effect, did it work? And how will you know if it worked? So for example, if you install berms to slow the overland flow of water, after some time, is the water slowed? Does the downhill system become less inundated? This type of monitoring is usually carefully designed based on a conceptual model of the system and supports cause and effect over meaningful time periods. This type of monitoring can also work very well for adaptation. So the main task this week is to consider what existing monitoring efforts are available. and if they need to be modified to better monitor the results of your adaptation actions. You can also consider what new monitoring items may be required to evaluate whether you have met your management goals. So here, key questions to include are, how do we know if the selected actions were effective? And what can we learn from these actions to inform future management? In this step in your adaptation workbook, you will first define your monitoring variable. Identify monitoring items will be useful to help evaluate whether you have achieved your management objectives and goals, or whether you have achieved a milestone that indicates progress toward your goal. So when possible, select monitoring items that will help you to understand whether the adaptation tactics recommended in the previous step were effective in working towards your management goals under climate change. So for example, if your tactic is to underplant with future adapted species that are suitable for your system, you may choose to monitor the survival rate of those particular seedlings. And this may be different from your standard surveys in that you are monitoring at a higher density or more frequently than usual. You will then identify a value or a threshold that is meaningful for this monitoring item. So think about the units that you're using to measure your metric and what your target number is. So based on the last example, what number of surviving seedlings would represent success? In this example, we have chosen 60% survival as the criteria that we will use for evaluation of future adapted native species. And finally, you will describe how and when this information will be gathered. So for example, you may monitor seedling survival every summer for 5 years after planting. Or because you might have some new species, maybe it's every year. And remember, it can save time and money if you take advantage of existing monitoring surveys or inventories. There are also existing networks like the Community Collaborative, Rain, Snow, and Hail Network, or the National Phenology Network that you can tap into, add your data, and download regional data. So you can think about other partnerships that can relieve some of the burden of this implementation. And please do let us know if there are other monitoring networks that are useful and that folks should be aware of, and feel free to add those in the chat box if you have any. So here are some examples of putting all of these together. So going through the first row here, the adaptation monitoring variable is invasive species control. The criteria for evaluation is areas identified for control have less than 20% cover from invasive species. And the monitoring implementation is annual invasive species surveys. And then the outcome is a realistic and feasible monitoring plan that can help determine whether management should be altered in the future to account for new information and observations. So you've all seen this graphic before, and it should you should all have an idea of the intentionality that each step brings into our climate-informed management plans. This is important because it helps connect the dots from broad concepts to specific actions for implementation. And this process works both ways. So as we finish our monitoring plans, our metrics are directly linked to measure the effectiveness of our adaptation tactics, which describe how we will implement our strategies and our overall concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition. We can trace these to the management challenges and opportunities and the direct impacts on our systems for which we have identified our goals and objectives. Monitoring ultimately helps us know whether we are on track to meet those management goals and objectives. And with all of that, we hope that you're ready to tackle this last step of the adaptation workbook. We do like this step because we find the brainstorming to be really fun, and hopefully you might find ways to tap into existing monitoring efforts. Now we'll open it up for any questions you might have for Leslie and I, either about step 5 or any questions about the course in general.
Yeah, I've got a question. This is Luke Grant. Would desired fewer condition, would desired future conditions be the best thing to focus on? You know, very clear, like 10 to 12 statement things that describe what the site looks like in a climate context.
Sorry, I was just getting some screens
Oh, no
pulled
worries.
up here. Yeah, so desired future conditions are often linked to your goals and objectives. And so with this step, linking your monitoring question specifically back to your goals and objectives, and also measuring something that's going to let you know whether or not those tactics that you developed in step 4 are effective. So if your ultimate goal, let's say, is to reduce invasive species cover by a certain percentage, and you had, let's say, a tactic around controlling invasive species through using goats or something, then your monitoring would be around the ultimate goal of reducing your invasive species, but perhaps you're doing it in such a way where you're measuring the effectiveness of using goats versus some other control. But you don't necessarily have to do it in a way where you're comparing some control either. It could just be, after implementation, did you see this change happening? Anyone else have questions?
I have a quick one. So far as if some of a little bit more detailed monitoring is not necessarily always feasible in your situation, should we kind of just put in more what the ideal monitoring situation would be?
I would start with what you're feasibly going to do. And so in some cases, it might just be like going out to a site and visually monitoring whether something happened, or maybe you're using photographic evidence, looking at changes. Maybe you're just doing a quick walkthrough to see if things worked out well. I would put that down. Now, if there are other things that you would like to do, if you got additional funding or you could find partners to work with, this would be a good time to also think through what are those additional questions you would like to answer that maybe you can't do at this time. And then that can help you figure out what additional investment that you would need to make to achieve those and answer those additional questions.
Okay.
Other questions? It's a great question so far. Nice to see all of you. If no one has anything else, I'll just keep going, and we can also answer more questions after the tutorial overview. So now I'm just going to give you a little some pointers on completing the online workbook for step 5. So here, what you're going to be doing is adding a monitoring variable and applying it to your objectives. Like I just mentioned before, we're really connecting it back to those original objectives that you laid out in step 1 and evaluated again in step 3. And your adaptation strategies, approaches, and tactics that you outlined in step 4 are also supposed to relate back to those objectives. And so we're relating everything back to those objectives. We're also going to be completing our homework for the 5th session, and then I'll also show you how to export and share your plan so that you can save a copy of your workbook and share it with your colleagues or your supervisor or your mom, because I know Danielle's mom is very interested in what she's up to at work, because she's always liking everything NIAX does on Facebook. So once you get into the workbook, you'll go to step 5, and it'll look kind of blank, like nothing's there. But don't worry, there's something there. There's a lot there. So you will click on Add a Monitoring Variable, and then what will come up is this little box, and you will write in text what your monitoring variable is. So for example, it could be success of planted tree seedlings. It could be percent reduction in invasive species. It could be any variety of things. Then your criteria for evaluation would be what criteria you're going to use for success. How do you know that you've been successful? So in the case of success of planted tree seedlings, it might be the rate of survival of planted seedlings is at least 75% at 5 years after planting. Be as quantitative as you can be about that threshold and the time frame in which you're monitoring it. Then the monitoring implementation, this is where we want you to write down how you're going to implement it. Maybe you have an established monitoring program with specific criteria that you're following, or perhaps you are implementing something new on your own. So just be as specific as possible here. Like if there's something you can link to, that we have an established monitoring plan, we'll be following that as part of this, you can put it in there. If you don't have an established monitoring plan, you might be more specific about what specific surveys you're going to do. Are you going to do them using on-the-ground measurements? Are you going to use remote sensing? Are you going to use cameras or a drone? All of those things could be listed in your implementation column. So when you're done with that, you'll click on Save, the orange button at the bottom. And then what will come up is what objectives are you going to link this monitoring variable to? And so there's just buttons you can click on, yes or no. So all of your objectives are going to show up here, and then you can just click on yes or no. And so if it only applies to one objective, just click on that one. If it applies to all of them, you can select all of them. Then you can go to add another monitoring variable and go through the same thing. And so the add another variable is in the bottom over on the right. Then when you click next, you're going to get to homework 5. And so don't forget to do your homework for this week. And there are 3 questions here. The first one is, what are the key questions you'll want to be able to answer to determine the effectiveness of your recommended tactics for climate change adaptation? And what are the metrics needed to answer these questions, and how and when will you collect the necessary measurements? And so that is just basically a summary of what you completed in step 5. So you don't need to create some new thing to answer here. Just summarize what you stated in step 5 of your workbook. And then some really brief questions we're asking you to gauge how well you can identify monitoring metrics, and how measurements through your monitoring plan can help adjust your future management. And then the last question is, what information do you already have to help you measure the effectiveness of your adaptation tactics? So in this case, it might mean monitoring programs you already have, or if you know of partner organizations that are already doing some monitoring that you could tap into, that would be another place you could highlight that. Now, this is the fun part. Once you have completed step 5, you are done with your workbook. And so you can now go down to the bottom where it says export and share plan, click on that, and you will get your plan, the full plan formatted in this view in your screen. Now, if you want to save a copy that you can email to your mom or Danielle's mom, because she'd love to see all of these, I'm sure, You can click on Print Current Version, which is in the blue box here. And what will come up is this little pop-up that says, this climate adaptation plan has been formatted for printing in landscape mode. And you click OK, and you will get to a print screen. Now, you could print it out at this point, or I would recommend that instead you save it as a PDF. So you can change it to print it, or you can, under the destination, just pick Save as PDF, and then click Save, and then save it to your drive, wherever you want to put it, your special like folder for mom, and you have it, and you can share it with your colleagues, save it for future use, and it's all nicely formatted to use as is, or you can copy and paste it into other documents as needed. So our assignment for next time is to complete step 5. So that's your monitoring and evaluating your effectiveness. And then you'll be completing your homework section after step 5. So you don't need to complete the homework 6 yet. That will be for next week. And then if you are feeling extra ambitious, you can also read this recommended paper. This talks about how you can use stand level monitoring data along with climate change information to evaluate risk using some of the tree atlas data that we talked about earlier in the course. And we hope you'll set aside maybe 2 to 3 hours depending on how many monitoring variables you're developing and how deep you want to go into doing any background reading. But just kind of keep that in mind as well. And then that is due Monday at 9 a.m. Is that correct, Danielle?
Mm-hmm.
9 a.m. Eastern, Central, 9 a.m. whatever time you are.
Whatever. I mean, the just set a deadline sometime on Monday, get it done. And I mean, we're getting you ready to then pull all these ideas together to create a presentation. So you do have a little bit of wiggle room there. But yeah, set your little calendar appointment to get it done on Monday.
And then looking ahead, so we do have a discussion session this week. So you'll be discussing your adaptation tactics and your monitoring ideas. You don't need to be done with step 5, but just start thinking about it in your discussion session. And then next week, Anna Maria and I will be back, and we'll be talking about communication concepts and tips. And this is honestly my favorite topic because I think it's so interesting to think about how we communicate to different audiences and what really resonates with people. And this often comes up a lot as being the biggest challenge in working in climate change adaptation, is how to communicate to each individual audience. So I will give you some tips and tricks, and then you're going to be applying those tips and tricks to your final presentation for the course. And that is all I have. It's a short lecture week. So if you want to stick around, we're happy to answer any questions you might have about step 4 or step 5. Or if you have a busy day, feel free to go on with your day.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm working with a land trust partner. They're the owner of the property that I'm using as my example. And I was wondering, will next week's communication and will next week's lecture be a good opportunity for them to kind of jump in? They haven't been super involved with the process, but I think they might be interested in talking about communication. Might I invite them?
I think they could certainly sit in on the lecture. We'll also be recording the lecture, and so that will be available to anyone who wants it.
Great.
I think we want to kind of keep the rapport of our discussion groups as is, but
that answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm sorry, yes, the discussion session is next week. Sorry, not this week. Sorry to add that confusion. All right. Sorry about that. We'll make a note of that for next time. But yeah, feel free to invite your partners to the lecture next week. That's totally fine. Other questions? No discussion this week.
This is Frank. I have a huge question, mostly for Danielle. Danielle, am I going to be able to do all this PDF? The program will put it together for a report for me, given the way that I'm doing it?
No, you're
I didn't
using
think so.
the Google Doc version, and so we can download it as a PDF, and you and I can work together to create a narrative format if that's something that you'd rather have.
See, in this week's discussion, I don't even know. I didn't even listen well enough, and I couldn't read the screen. I don't even know what the 3 questions are for the session 5 homework assignment.
Basically, like, did you do it? And what are the major ideas that have come out of that thinking? That's all those questions are always about, is like, give us, the summed up version of the work that you did. I'll work with you, Frank, to get you.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
Okay.
It seems like every week I get discouraged at this point, because I said
You shouldn't. I told you can't watch this part.
I've just looked at a whole presentation that's based on the online, and that's not the way I'm doing it. So it's like, I'm wondering, should I have spent my time watching reruns of South Park or what?
You can cleanse your palate.
Well, thanks for sticking with us. And I think, yeah, Danielle will help sort out any questions you might have. Any other questions on the online version or anything else that we covered today?
Yeah, I've got a question. Given the high percentage of the clients I work with may only do 1 of 12 recommendations, is there some sort of way to rank the severity of the problems that will likely result from that inaction as part of a climate change scenario? Like planning for people not to implement it, and what that will likely do in terms of their desired future conditions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in that case, what I would recommend is using basically a risk matrix for prioritization. And so we can share with you what that would look like. But basically what you're looking at is, what is the severity of no action to your place? Like if you didn't do the adaptation action, what would be the severity of the climate change impact to your place? And then how likely is it to happen? And so you're multiplying that likelihood by severity. So those things that have very high likelihood of happening and very high severity of an impact are going to be high risk, right? And those are the things you want to prioritize. And the things that have lower severity or lower likelihood are going to have lower risk, and then those would not be as high of a priority.
And then I'm also interested in discussions about kind of canaries in the coal mine. What are the emerging best bird species or understory herbaceous layer species that can be useful indicator species of achieving our objectives?
Yeah, oh my gosh, that's a $1 million question, I think. These like indicator species questions come up a lot, and it's going to really depend a lot on your particular location and what objectives you're trying to achieve on that particular site. So I can't like give sort of a, generalization. But I would say if there is, a species on your site that has very specific habitat requirements that you're concerned about, that you're trying to manage for, you could use that, the success of that species as your indicator species. But this is something that, oh gosh, the Forest Service spends forever and a day thinking about. So I can't really give you answers because like all the smartest people in the world are thinking about this and can't agree on it.
Yeah, maybe I should clarify my question. What's more interesting to me is the process I'm using to try to, I'm just trying to get the dart on the board, and like I think right now, like I'm looking at like the state wildlife management plan and looking for threatened and endangered species or species of greatest conservation need, and then I'm looking at the habitat types on the site, and if that's the state of the art, what everybody else is doing, I'm happy with that. But if there's other stuff I haven't started to do, I'd love to get studied up on that.
Yeah, some states have completed wildlife vulnerability assessments where they have ranked species based on their climate change vulnerability. So that could be a way of that usually combines sort of whether they're a species of conservation concern with their climate vulnerability. And so that would be an additional thing that you could look at. For plant species, yeah, usually it's those species of conservation concern that also have very narrow habitat requirements, which end up often being the focus. But it's going to really depend on what's present at your particular site. And also maybe looking at species that are on the southern end of their range or at the western edge of their range, where they might be vulnerable to shifts in temperature and precipitation. Good questions. I don't know, did that help? Or are you still feeling, no, I don't think anyone has a silver bullet answer.
No, absolutely, that helps. And really fascinated, just to have the conversation is great.
Thanks. I see a cat here. My cat was also here for the lecture, but she left for the discussion. She didn't want to contribute to that part. The tail just going across.
That was Ebony.
Oh, well, she's beautiful.
And Leslie, I'm here because of my attendance at the Longwood seminar 3 or 4 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I was so impressed by what you said, and I carried with me the thought that one day I'm going to do this. And here I am. I live in a retirement community next door to Longwood. So my colleague Bob and I are here to learn what we can about how to manage the urban forest we have in our arboretum.
That's great. Somebody asked, how often are people using diversity index to monitor? That definitely is a good indicator. It's something that a lot of people use. There's several different indices that you can use. But if your goal is to increase diversity, using a diversity index is a great way of measuring that. And it could be, you can look at just, species richness, like the number of different species, but then you can do like a Shannon, Wiener, or Simpson's diversity index that will give you a sense of how evenly distributed those species are. Any other questions people have?